Good evening. Tonight I'll be teaching from Matthew chapter 23, verses 1 through 12. And that reads, Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, The teachers of law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must be careful to do everything they tell you, but do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Everything they do is done for people to see. They make phylacteries and wide and their tassels on their garments long. They love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. They love to be greeted with respect in the marketplace and be called rabbi by others. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. And do not call anyone on earth father, for you have one Father, and he is in heaven. Nor are you to be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant, and for those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. To say it bluntly, Jesus is calling out the Pharisees. What for? Well, we see in 1 through 4, he first called the Pharisees out for their hypocrisy. Jesus says in 3 and 4, So you must be careful to do everything they tell you, but do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders. So what Jesus is saying here is that they are basically talking the talk, but not walking the walk. They were going around teaching and preaching, saying you have to live like this and do that like that. They were laying heavy loads and big responsibilities on other people, but yet not upholding those same standards for themselves. Let's say I told my neighbor to mow his lawn and even showed him how to do it, but they never touched my own. The neighbor might say, Why should I mow my lawn when the person that told me and taught me how doesn't even mow his own? Let's take a quick look at Matthew chapter 5, verse 16. In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. I think this scripture comments nicely for what I'm trying to say, which is let people learn from your actions and not just your words. Let's go back to verse 5 of chapter 23. Everything they do is done for people to see, and they make their phylacteries wide and the tassels on their garments long. They love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats at synagogues. They love to be greeted with respect in the marketplace and be called rabbi by others. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. And do not call anyone on earth father, for you have one Father, and he is in heaven. Nor are you to be called instructor, for you have one instructor, Messiah. Here we see the Pharisees being self-centered and allowing all the glory and praise going to them instead of redirecting the praise to the Lord. They are wearing tassels and phylacteries, which phylacteries is like a leather strap with a box that goes on your forehead that held like ancient Hebrew scripture. Basically to show how holy and how good they were while they were truly empty and nothing on the inside. Then we see them allowing themselves to be called rabbi, which is a word that means master or teacher, a title that only belongs to the Lord. We have to make sure we are giving all glory and praise to the Lord. Let's quickly look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 31. And that reads, So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of the Lord. Whatever you're doing, whether it's giving a lesson, discussing something with a friend, or even praying by yourself, make sure all praise goes to the Lord. I'll take the last two verses a little bit more closely. The greatest among you will be your servant. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. What I get from this last part, it's in the end the humble who will be exalted in the kingdom of heaven, and not the ones who exalt themselves on the time of the earth and not the Lord. To close out, let's look at what we learned. Number 1, practice what you preach. 2, let your actions speak, not just your words. 3, make sure to give all glory to the Lord. And 4, always have a humble heart and mind. Thank you for your kind attention.
Tonight I will be reading Matthew 23:37 through 39. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophecies and the stones those who are sent to it. How often I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing to see your house left to you desolate, for you tell you will not see me again until you say, Blessed be he who comes in the name of the Lord. Thank you for this is the word of the Lord.
Thank you, Waylon, for that message. You did a great job. That helped set things up perfectly for tonight. And Josh, that was an excellent reading of God's Word. Very proud of you guys. We pick up in the 23rd chapter of Matthew, just after the section that Waylon read for us. And in the section Waylon read, Jesus is talking to the multitude, and he's kind of pointing out some of the challenges that the Pharisees face, the things that they are doing before people, how they kind of say one thing and then do another. And then Jesus launches into a section of 8 woes, which is basically him saying very strongly, this is what you all, the Pharisees, are doing incorrectly. And really being very pointed and direct at them. One of the things that we can understand about God's Word, and especially the words that Jesus speaks, is when Jesus says one thing in one place, and he has said something over in another place, those two things line up together. And there's a reason for that, and we can learn from some of those things. And as we go through these 8 woes that are here, I want us to also consider back in Matthew, the 5th chapter, the Beatitudes. Because as you'll see, the things he tells the Pharisees are exact opposite of what he told those who listened to the Sermon on the Mount when he was talking about those Beatitudes. And we'll line those things up as we go through that. So if we pick this up in verse 13, he says, "But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men, for you neither go in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in." Ultimately, what he's telling them is they were enemies of the cause of bringing people to heaven. They're standing in the way of that. They were standing in the door, they were locking the gate, however you want to look at that. They were shutting those things up to those that were needing to hear those things. And the multitude around listening at this time certainly contained many people who needed to hear that message and were looking for that door and that place to go. We can say about the Pharisees that they had a lofty opinion of themselves. They had a desire for fame, for fortune, for preeminence above all others. And all those things became a way for them to close the doors of heaven to others that they felt were beneath them. In Matthew, the 5th chapter, Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." So you have a group of people here who thought they had the kingdom of heaven in their hands, but they weren't poor in spirit. They were very lofty in their opinion of themselves, and the things they were doing, as I said, were blocking the doors of heaven. Jesus said in Matthew 5, that's not the attitude to have. We have to be poor in spirit. And by doing that and having that attitude, we then have access to the kingdom of heaven. In verse 14, he says, the second woe, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. Therefore, you will receive greater condemnation." You know, regarding widows, it seems if you kind of look into this a little bit, they had a practice of kind of, maybe kind of asserting themselves upon widows, maybe for different reasons. Maybe it was for the idea of, well, we'll go to this person and we'll have them kind of entertain and prepare a meal or whatever the case may be, just kind of, insert themselves into their life. Other times we find that maybe they were endearing themselves to those that were widows. Maybe somebody was widowed and perhaps had a bit of an estate that was left to them. And so these Pharisees may endear themselves to them and do so in such a way that they could acquire the things that they had. If you look at Proverbs 15, verse 25, it says, "The Lord will destroy the house of the proud, but he will establish the boundary of the widow." If you look in the Old Testament, God very was very clear what he felt about those that were widowed and the care that they were to be given and the protections, the boundaries, if you will, that were afforded them to care for them. And so this idea that they would, as Jesus said, devour widows' houses, that they would go to them and for their own gain and to gain things for themselves, certainly was against that. He also said there in the same verse that they were making long prayers. He says, for a pretense, they make long prayers. In Matthew 23, verse 5, back to the section that Waylon talked about earlier, all their works they do to be seen by men. We know that they would stand and pray and do so in such a way that they would be seen and that they would be heard. To give themselves that view that we are better than others, that we want you to think how religious we are and how close to God we are. That same verse continued, they made their phylacteries broad and enlarged the border of their garments. We know that they didn't just try to do the things that they thought were holy. They tried to make themselves extra holy by making sure that they stood out before other people. Matthew chapter 5, verse 4, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. You know, God had a very different view of those that were widowed, those that mourn. He said they would be comforted. The Pharisees were not comforting. They were devouring. He says, woe to you scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel land and sea to win one proselyte, and when he is won, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. Here he puts out the idea that they went far and wide, to bring people into their, I call it a fraternity maybe, if you will. They brought them into that. It was like, let's go out and find people that can be part of our group, to proselytize. Their cause was so important to them that they didn't shrink from it. They were so much about pursuing bringing people to this that they didn't shrink back from it. You get the idea that they are people with pride, a lot of pride in this group that they were. Pride that they thought they stood out from others, pride that they thought they were closer to God than others. And so they wouldn't shrink back from that. Pride was definitely a challenge. And pride is kind of one of those things that's like, it's my way. And that's what they were really focused on, was when they're going out and proselytizing. It's like, we have this thought in our mind of how we think things should be. They were very quick to tell everybody else how it should be. And we'll get some examples here in a minute of other things, but they were very quick to do that. And so really what they were bringing people to was their way. They weren't interested in bringing people to God. It was, I'm interested in bringing people to what I do and what I think is the right way. And that's something we have to be careful of, because we can be prideful as well. We can have a lot of pride in what we think is the right thing, but if it does not align to God's will, then we can become guilty of the same thing. Jesus said in Matthew 5:5, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Where the Pharisees went far and wide to win a proselyte, Jesus tells us that the meek are the ones that shall inherit the earth. Verse 16, he says, woe to you blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple, it is nothing. But whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he is obliged to perform it. Fools and blind, which is greater, the gold of the temple? Which is greater, the gold or the temple that sanctifies the gold? There, I get it out. And whoever swears by the altar, it is nothing, but whoever swears by the gift that is on it, he is obliged to perform it. Fools and blind, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifies the gift? It becomes very clear when we look at the Pharisees, that they are seeking worldly gain. And they became blinded because of this. He calls them blind guides. Not only were they blinded, but they were still trying to lead others and thinking they were leading them in right paths. Jesus lays out some things that they were teaching about, swearing by the temple or the altar or the gifts that were on them. These are things that they were teaching falsely. It was kind of this, well, if you go out and make these promises, and if you do it on this thing, well, that makes it, you really have to do it. You're obliged to. You can't let that go. And he makes note there their preference for gold in the offerings that they would bring. It's interesting because surely somebody that was drawn to the things of the world and trying to gain those things, somebody that would, as we read earlier, devour a widow's house to try to gain things for themselves, the gold that was offered would certainly become important. Surely they wanted to gain that for themselves. You might say that they had a hunger for the gifts that were brought, a hunger for the things of this world, and they sought to be filled by those things. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, verse 6, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled." You see, they were never satisfied. There was always more. They always wanted more. And they were always pressing that upon people. They always had that hunger for those things. But Jesus said those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, well, they're the ones that are going to be filled. In verse 23, he says, "Woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. Blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel." They like to make known their tithing, the things that they were tithing, these various small things. It was a practice that they liked to make known. And he noticed the things that he mentions there, mint and anise and cumin. These are, spices, herb spices that were being divided up. Even today, they're not necessarily very expensive items. And so if you think about it a little bit, they're making a big show of tithing these things when it's something that costs them very little to have in their possession. If you remember Luke 18, verse 12, mentioning one of these praying, "I fast twice a week, I give tithes of all that I possess." That idea of let me put it out there in front of the world to hear. Look at me, look at what I do. A practice, again, that cost them very little. Jesus continues by saying they were guilty of transgressing far greater things, far more important things they were transgressing. They showed no mercy in the small matters while they turned a blind eye to the weightier matters of the law. He says you ought to be practicing these things, justice, mercy, faith. They weren't doing any of those things, but yet they were very clear that these small items were tithing those. And not only that, they were also blindly leading others by saying, you need to do the same thing. And if they didn't do that, they were pointing that out publicly in front of others. Again, trying to push the things that would say, this is my way and this is the way we should do it. They struggled with showing mercy. In Matthew 5, verse 7, Jesus said, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy." I kind of wonder if any of these guys heard those words from the Sermon on the Mount and then later heard him speaking these things. If they were wise enough to put the two together. I don't think they were, but they should have heard him say these things. And yet here he is pointing out they have no mercy. They're worried about these small, tiny things. And he says you can't even practice these things that are far more important for people that are around them. They needed mercy. They needed justice. And yet they weren't being given those things. And Jesus came to give those to the people that were listening. So he wanted to make sure that they understood what mercy truly means and how to obtain it. In verse 25, he again says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you cleanse the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of extortion and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first cleanse the inside of the cup and dish, that the outside of them may be clean also." Jesus highlights this idea of impurity. If you remember, the Pharisees were very adamant about purity in a lot of things, ritual practices. They had previously pointed these things out to Jesus and his disciples, ways that they had, in their mind, failed to be pure in certain acts. Eating things without washing their hands, things like that. They were very quick to point out the idea of being impure. And yet Jesus is standing here pointing this out and saying, you cleanse the outside of the cup, you make the outside all clean, but you're leaving everything that's inside. I mean, guys, if you go home tonight and you help clean up the dinner dishes, you tell your wife you're going to clean those up, and you wash the outside and you leave whatever was cooked for dinner in there, leave that till tomorrow. Try it out and see how happy she is tomorrow. He's saying you all are doing this with your lives. You're cleaning the outside. You're making that appearance look like it's something important, something great, but yet you didn't clean the inside of the cup. And they were fully aware of their appearance. That was something, as we've pointed out, and as Waylon pointed out in his message, they were aware of their appearance. They knew what they were presenting to the world, and they wanted to present that. They focused on the outward acts of purity, but inside, he says, they were self-indulgent, full of extortion, he says. They weren't about what was going on around them. They were about themselves. That's what they were focused on. In Matthew 5 and verse 8, back to the Beatitudes, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." Jesus didn't say, "Blessed are the pure on the outside. It doesn't matter what your heart thinks." He said, "The pure of heart." What's inside? You need to cleanse the inside, just like he's telling the Pharisees. That's how you will see God. In verse 27, he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which indeed appear beautiful outwardly, but inside are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. Even so, you also outwardly appear righteous to men, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness." He continues that theme there of their appearance. How do they appear on the outside? What they do with their outside. He says they do so in such a way they're like a whitewashed tomb with dead men's bones inside. They clean that outside up. It looks great from the outside, but what's really inside is something that is dead. It's rotting. It has no life to it. Jesus highlights the idea of their appearance and also equates it to them being lawless hypocrites. Lawlessness implies that their actions continue to set themselves at odds with God. That's the exact opposite of what God called them to be in the first place. They should have been people that were helping others draw nearer to God, not to their own way of living. They should have been helping people that were at odds with God because of their sin get rid of those things and make peace with God. And yet their lives and the way they lived, they were at odds and they weren't at peace with God themselves. And so in Matthew 5:9, Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." The Pharisees presented themselves as being near to God, close to God. But Jesus said it's the peacemakers. The peacemakers are the ones that have the attributes of God. It's not these lawless hypocrites that were standing before them, living for themselves and drawing people to their own way of living. He said it was the peacemakers. In verse 29, he continues, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous. And say, if we had lived in those days of our fathers, we would not have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets. Therefore you are witnesses against yourselves that you are the sons of those who murdered the prophets." I was thinking about this, and I thought, in this final piece here, Jesus really kind of drops the hammer, if you will. He lays it all out on them. He says, you go out here and you build these tombs. You adorn these monuments of the ones you call righteous. This kind of goes back to that idea of a whitewashed tomb. You put this facade out there, and then you come back and you say, well, if we'd have lived in the days of our fathers, we wouldn't have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets. We would have been better than this. And Jesus says, by you saying that, you're admitting you're the son of these people. You have their attributes. You are doing the same things. He continues there. I don't have it on the screen, but he continues. Verse 32, "Fill up then the measure of your father's guilt. Serpents, brood of vipers, how can you escape the condemnation of hell? Therefore, indeed, I send you prophets, wise men, and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Assuredly, I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation." We had a lesson a while back. I have to say this. We had a lesson a while back about what we should and should not call people names. We can't call them idiots or things like that. Someone in my house, I won't name names, said, yes, but we can call them a brood of vipers because Jesus did. I want you to read that and understand Jesus was very, very clear on what they were doing. He was saying, you are these people. You are the ones that are going to do this. And it plays out. They were going to do the same things. He knows what's coming. He knows that he's going to be crucified. He knows that they have this in their heart to do this. Their fathers did the same thing. All the generations before wouldn't listen when God sent prophets to them and told them how to live and do things right. And they're doing the same thing to Jesus day in and day out. They're trying to find a way to tear him down and ultimately going to crucify him. Well, in Matthew chapter 5, go back to the Beatitudes, verse 10. "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Prior to this, Jesus had said all of these things. You're going to be persecuted. You believe these things. You believe in me. You're going to be persecuted. And don't be surprised, because guess what? They did it before, and now he says they're going to do it again. They had this in their hearts. Jesus laid out before them the persecution that was there, and they had an opportunity to hear this and hear these words and change their thinking. And so you can start to understand, as Jesus is drawing nearer to the cross and he's seeing the way these people are reacting, you can see the fact that he is taught day in and day out and been among the people, and he can see those that are listening and drawing near to him compared to those who should be and aren't. And you can see that frustration, and you can see why he's saying all these things to them. And you can also see why, when he says these words, the anger within them is building. And certainly their hearts are becoming harder, colder, and preparing to take him soon to crucify him. And so Jesus then Turns to the last section that Josh read for us. He says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I say to you, you shall see me no more until you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Jerusalem, Jerusalem." That emphatic groaning as he looks up on the city that should have been known as a place where peace would be brought to the world. And yet, in the days and years ahead, battles will rage here. Soon, there'll be a battle for the soul of man. It'll sit upon the shoulders of Jesus as he hangs upon the cross. A battle with Satan that will take place, which ultimately does bring peace to the world. If you think about some of the things that were said in the Old Testament, Lamentations 1 verse 1, how lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow is she who was great among the nations. The princess among the provinces has become a slave. You go all the way back to the Old Testament, and you look at how God viewed his people and what God wanted his people to be. He wanted them to be a prophet among the nations. He wanted them to be a priest before the nation. He wanted them to be drawn to him and glorify him so that other nations around them could see him. And yet what did they do? They turned away from him time and time again. And ultimately they became a slave. We know in the Old Testament, they became slaves to other nations, went into captivity. So they became desolate. Why did this happen? Lamentations 1 verse 8, "Jerusalem has sinned gravely, therefore she has become vile. All who honored her despise her because they have seen her nakedness, yet she sighs and turns away." It comes down to the fact that they turned away from God. They continuously turned away from God. Time and again, they would fall into their sins. Sometimes they would come back for a short time, and then they would turn away again. Jesus talked about, as he looks upon this city, he says, "This is the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her." But now we look ahead beyond his life into Acts, and look what happens. When they heard these things, they were cut to the heart and they gnashed at him. Speaking of Stephen, as Stephen has preached that lesson and really laid before them all their faults and all the sins that the nation had. They gnashed their teeth when they heard those things. They were angered. And then they cried out with a loud voice and stopped their ears and ran at him with one accord and cast him out of the city and stoned him. And the witnesses laid down their clothes at the feet of a young man named Saul. Jesus said, "Blessed are those who are persecuted." Jesus lamented over Jerusalem and the prophets that had been sent and those that had been stoned. Jesus would become the one that was killed, and those that would follow, who continued to preach the gospel, would also suffer at the hands of those who would not believe. Now Saul was consenting to his death, and at that time a great persecution arose against the church, which was at Jerusalem. And they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. It seems interesting that the place that Jesus laments over, this place where the prophets had been stoned and killed, the place where Jesus hangs on a cross and gives up his life, the place where those who were faithful following his death and resurrection would begin preaching the gospel, again would go back and stone those that were coming before them. and yet the gospel would be spread through the world because of this. If you think about the Beatitudes that Jesus talked about, he said, those who are poor in spirit mourn, they're meek. Those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, those who are merciful, pure in heart, those who are peacemakers, those who are persecuted. He said, this is the type of person you are to be. The opposite, though, is what we see in the Pharisees. They were a roadblock to those in heaven. They devoured the weak. They had pride in their own ways. They wanted people to follow them. They didn't care if they followed God's will. They followed what they thought. They had a hunger for things of the world. They were unable to show mercy and justice. They were impure. They were lawless. And ultimately, Jesus says, they were the persecutors of the faithful. It's interesting to look at that and kind of look at the progression on both sides, because it starts there at the top. What is in our heart? Are we pure in spirit? Are we poor in spirit? Have we emptied ourselves of the pride of the things that we so desire in this life? Emptied ourselves of the sins that come before us? Or are those things becoming a roadblock to ourselves and to others? See, the warning here is very clear and very strong. I think why Jesus was very adamant about the things he was saying is simply because they were the very opposite of what he desired from his followers. It's something we can take home with us, a lesson for us to consider as we go through our week. If we're guilty of some of these things, if we're struggling with them, then it's time for us to kind of take a step back and go back to what Jesus taught in that Sermon on the Mount. Go look at the way he wanted people to think and behave and act before the world. And consider those Pharisees and the struggles they had and the problems they had in their life and how they were so separated from God. And perhaps we can help others see that as well. The lesson is yours tonight. I hope this was beneficial and maybe giving you a different view of these woes and making that comparison to the Sermon on the Mount. If there's someone here tonight who has a need, we always want to extend an invitation. If someone needs the prayers of the church, if we can support you in a challenge that you're having and pray with you and help you in any way we can, we'd ask you to let us know. And if there's someone here tonight who has never become a child of God, has never been baptized, we would ask you to make that need known as well.